One of the machines was quite large. It was about 100 terabytes. During the replication, it would get to like 95%, 99%, and it would just fail. That's not good because this machine was the crown jewels. We discovered that there was a bug in the Zerto application. The customer was very understanding, but they said, listen, is there anything else we can do? Maybe not the slickest way to migrate this machine, but what is a way that will get it done? It just didn't have all of its data. So let's just build your virtual disks back. And then we resorted to good old-fashioned.
William, you sent me a few things to talk about and really get into, and there's a common theme across all of them. And this energy customer of yours that we're going to focus and spend time on had the same thing. It seems to be true, right? And reading this, of course, I project a little bit because I see this a lot and I talk about this a lot, but the promise of the cloud, like, oh, the cloud is here, the cloud is great, move everything to the cloud. And a lot of enterprises following that and pushing into these digital transformation projects and cloud transformation projects, and then getting to a point where it's maybe not the right path for them. And I've seen this a lot of different ways. And I really want to I want to start with asking you and talking about just that set of background.
Sure.
What drove them to the cloud, and which cloud, what was the promise, and what was that inflection point for them?
So this was a customer in the energy sector, right? And they were a current customer of ours, consuming, co-location at the data center. They had some workloads in our multi-tenant cloud and managed firewall, right? And life is good, right? They're consuming our resources, and they've been a customer for several years. I mean, like 5 or 6 years. And they had an initiative to build an application and to get it done quickly. And I'm not saying shadow IT, but they're like, hey, take our credit card, let's swipe some Azure and let's start building the application. And let's build it and, see if it's going to work for us. And they built an application and deployed it into Azure. All good. They actually had some express route to go between our data center and Azure. And what they found is they were able to get the application up and test it and do many iterations until it became the perfect app for them. But they started becoming successful with it and actually uploading more and more and more and more and more data. And the price kept going up and up and up and up. And, they came to us, they came to us and they were like, hey, look, this is getting expensive. More so than what we're paying, to host our workloads in your cloud. And, they came to us and they're like, what we need to migrate from Azure to our Baton Rouge multi-tenant cloud here at DartPoints. And, some of the things that they really were looking is like, hey, we want to, reduce the cost of the solution, right? We need to save money. And their spend with Azure was up into like the $30K a month cost. And we need to reduce this. And a lot of it's disk storage, and a lot of it's, bandwidth and throughput and things like this. And also when the application spins up, resources become more taxed, and that equates into bigger bills, right? So that was really the first thing, is lower the cost. They also wanted to consolidate their cloud spend. They're like, look, we're paying Azure, we're paying money for express route, we're also paying you guys for colocation and all of the services that we get. They're in the Louisiana area, so they're relatively close to our data center. So they're like, we really want to bring this application back home, right? And then, they wanted to say, okay, this is where we want to go. It's going to reduce complexity. It's going to reduce cost, right? So we can migrate, but we need to migrate the solution out of Azure with very small amounts of downtime, right? We can't be down because it's now a critical application, right? You develop it, let's just see if it works. Okay, it works. It becomes relatively successful, and now it's a dependent application. And they were like, we got to migrate this data out of out of Azure to save money and to be less complex, right? We can maybe shave some things off. So, they came to us and said, listen, what do we do? How do we get there? And, of course, the first things we do when we're working with customers like this is we do the obligatory workshop, right? Let's see what the application does. Let's try to understand what are your challenges. And, we do let's see how much it's going to cost coming to us. Let's see if it's feasible. Let's make sure you're ready to move from Azure to, an on-prem or a data center like DartPoints. Let's make sure it's the right fit. So we go in and we look and see, are you consuming any Azure resources or solutions that we can't provide? If it's something like platform as a service or something that's not a great fit, we want to identify those before talking about billing and migrating and, actually the steps it takes. So, our game plan was we sat down with them, we did the workshop, we did the whiteboards, we understood the application. And the customer was already, and our goal is to convince them it's the right solution or convince them it's the wrong solution. Stay in Azure. Maybe that spend in Azure is justified and your best route to success is staying where you're at, So we take a very consultative approach when we work with customers, right?
I'm scribbling notes here fast. What's interesting about this is, depending on the company organization, right? You start talking about org hierarchy and what does the actual org look like, and then you say, okay, who owns the application and how does that application then get budgeted and reflected internally? Is this an externally facing revenue generating application? Is this an internal productivity tool that's used by the organization? And then that dictates a lot of, responsibilities as well, like who actually owns these things. And you have organizations that still have traditional IT infrastructure roles. Maybe that reports up into the CFO or the finance administration side of the house, or you have a software development team that goes to a CTO, and right. So you get in all these different org hierarchies. The conversation around this is costing us too much money, or we've realized this is going to continue to cost us too much money and we're going to continue to scale and invest in this, and maybe this is something we don't want to. That sounds very much like a finance conversation. Like somebody, that's pressure from a CFO looking at numbers, and the numbers are only going one direction. And then really, ideally, look, in my world, cloud spend going through the roof is okay as long as the revenue spend is going up, with it, right? Or the revenue coming in goes up with it, right? But when you start looking at that and you say, okay, cloud's going up, but revenue's not, or that they're not directly correlated with each other, that should get people's attention. But then also that drives, and you touched on this a little bit, the migration process is really complex. Yes. This isn't for a lot of people, this isn't just, even if let's just say in the easiest way, say you've completely containerized, you're not serverless, you're not completely integrated with any of the cloudy tools, and you have an application you can forklift out really easy. It still requires a lot of human capital to move your application back. And in this case, it's like what's the expression? The juice has to be worth the squeeze, right? And I find a lot of time these projects stop because the perceived risk or the perceived level of effort to do that migration just becomes this point of paralysis. But in this case, they migrated, they pulled out. So that, somebody inside the organization, there's strong executive, we're going to make a change.
And that's that was easy for us. Cause when we're working with customers, we have to be, IT administrator, solutions architect, finance person. We have to talk about really all the challenges that a customer has to face when migrating to a data center or away from a hyperscaler, right? So it's not just, can we do it? How do we do it? It's why do we do it? Is it really going to save you money? Is it going to save you headache? And when we actually had the IT director, the system administrator, and I think we had the finance person in our data center, right? And we were whiteboarding and we were looking at let's make sure it's the right decision. And, at the end of this conversation, the finance person said, listen, you had me at migrate out of Azure. Thank you for doing
Oh
all this
no.
workshopping with us. It's really great. But basically, we had done the homework already because they were a previous, they
Yeah.
were already a customer. So they're like, William, I appreciate all of the diligence and the architecting and the consulting, but we're ready to get out of Azure.
This is a pretty big divide for a customer profile now within cloud environments, right? Because you have the original promise of elastic resources or ephemerality and ability to scale up and scale down and unpredictable workloads, and then you've got most enterprises that are relatively static or steady workflow. I mean, there's a high degree of predictability of an application once the application hits production. Right?
That's the thing is with that is that's true in some cases, and in other cases it becomes the old saying, pay as you go broke. Pay as you go is great, and having that elasticity is fantastic. The problem is it's tied to your credit card, and that becomes a source of pain, right? Especially if you become successful or the application takes off or you start using it more. In this particular solution, it was an internal application that supported some of their energy research, and like I said, they had already made the decision for the most part before they came to us. They're like, look, this is what we're doing, William, but let's walk through the process. And for them, the way how we leverage cloud really, we give the customer the flexibility of a pay-as-you-go architecture, right, where they can allocate additional resources when they need. But the one thing that's really good about the solutions that we have, especially when it comes to cloud, whether it's multi-tenant cloud or single-tenant cloud, is the customer is very simple billing, right? You pay for disk, you pay for CPU, you pay for RAM, network, and bandwidth, and that's what you get. And no matter how much you use the actual compute, it's not going to spike to where you get out of whack. Plus, again, we're very flexible and nimble on what we can do for customers in terms of creative billing, creative invoicing, and some of the things we do to kind of alleviate the sting of getting a bill at the end of the month that's $30,000. It's more than what you were expecting. So really, after we went through the workshop and made sure that the customer was really cool with getting out of Azure, we started looking at what's the easiest way, right? What's the way to go? And it was funny. So we're a VMware-based, right now we're a VMware-based cloud, whether if it's vSphere, single tenant, or running vCloud Director in a multi-tenant environment. And at the time, my role as solutions architect, I also did a lot of research and development, or I did a lot of like product testing. And, going with the customer's desire to have minimal downtime, this was important to them. So I was looking at one of the products we use for our DRaaS solution is a product called Zerto, right? And it allows customers to do real-time replication of their virtual machines from, in how we use it, we typically see customers doing VMware to VMware replication, whether that's VMware to vSphere, VMware vSphere to vSphere, or VMware vSphere to vCloud Director. We also have some customers that do Hyper-V to, across hypervisors into VMware. But one of the things I was testing, because I'm very interested in what people and how people leverage public cloud, meaning the hyperscalers, looking at ease of moving workloads around. When I first started running virtualization back in the day, it was crazy awesome technology, but the issue was, how do you move the VMs around? How do you make them mobile? And one of the tools that we really invested in and really use a lot even today is the Zerto product, right? And so I was in the lab working probably a few months before this customer came to us, and I was testing Azure to vCloud Director replication, where you have some workloads running in Azure. You go to the Azure Marketplace, you say, oh, there's my Zerto cloud appliance. Let me deploy that. And I had done several testing, did several testing, sessions, right? Even did lunch and learns and like show and tell to the rest of my engineering team. I'm like, look, guys, if we ever have a customer that needs to get in or out of Azure, this is the tool that we can use. And, I did my testing with our team, did documentation, how-tos. So that our offering to the customer was kind of already built a couple of months before we actually were talking to them. So we had really good success in lab. And, when we had a follow-up session with the customer, we said, hey, we want to use this product. This is going to be able to replicate the VMs from Azure's Prim into ours. Piece of cake, right? It's never always a piece of cake, but in this particular case, it was. And it wasn't a lot of VMs. I think we had maybe 5 virtual machines that we were migrating, right? Well, 4 of the machines were relatively small, a couple of 100 gigabytes of storage, some SQL. They were all Windows. And those tested really well. One of the things we like about the Zerto product is before we actually fail over, we can do a failover test, right? Non-disruptive. Mm-hmm. Let's see how these machines fail over in a isolated environment. And all of our testing for 4 of the 5 machines, beautiful, no problem. We were able to fail over from Azure. We could fail back if we needed to. So if we had an issue where something just wasn't right, we could fail back or back out of the failover. But one of the machines was quite large. And when I say large, it was about 100 terabytes, 106 terabytes worth of data. And, so at the time there wasn't really a problem. We set up the replication target. We started replicating, and we told the customer ahead of time, it's like, listen, this particular VM probably is going to take a little while to replicate, even replicating over your express route connection, right? And, so 4 of the machines, no problem. We got to the 5th machine, the really super huge, supersized me virtual machine, and we had issues. It would get to, during the replication, it would get to like 95%, 99%, and it would just fail. And of course, that's not good, because this machine was like it was the crown jewels. It wasn't a very complex machine. It was a file server, but it was failing on us. So of course, we stop, we halt processes, we halt what we do. We call our vendors, we call our support, we call, VMware and Zerto, and collaborate on how to fix the problem. And it came out, when we were working with Zerto, we discovered that there was a bug in the Zerto application, right? In the actual build that was the latest build at the time. And it had a problem with disks that were over 16 terabytes. Okay. Well, the machine that we were working on basically had, 4 or 5 20 to 30 terabyte disks. So really, really That's huge. Good. And, we were like, okay, we have this problem. How do we fix it? Zerto comes back to us a couple of days later, and they're like, listen, we're going to have a fix for this. And it may take a little bit of time. It may come out on our next big build, but hang tight, right? So we go back to our customer and we're like, Mr. Customer, Mrs. Customer, this is the problem we're having. It's not a problem that we can easily solve. And the customer was very understanding, but they said, listen, is there anything else we can do? we need to get this machine over to DartPoints. And we're like, well, it could be a month before the Zerto patch is out, and then of course once it comes out, we have to test it, we have to go through QA. But this is the situation we're in, and they were like, look, we don't want to spend another month of Azure services. We're really ready to get out. So we kind of took a step back and said, okay, what's the maybe not the slickest way to migrate this machine, but what is a way that will get it done, right? The good thing is it was a file server. Windows file server, not a lot of applications, not a lot of complex, we're not running Oracle or SQL Server on this machine. It was basically just a file server. So what we ended up doing was excluding the disks that were the super huge machine, the super huge volumes, right? So we only replicated the boot drive, like the C drive. And we set up the replication again. We were able to fail over the virtual machine with just the boot drive. So it would come online and would function, right? It just didn't have all of its data. So what we ended up doing was failing it over to our multi-tenant cloud. So from Azure to Baton Rouge, we brought the machine up, changed the machine name so we could have both machines up and running at the same time. They would see each other, but nothing like NetBIOS conflicts, IP addressing, nothing to where it would stop us. And then what we did is we said, let's just build your virtual disks back, right, in our cloud. So we recreated blank virtual disks. And then we resorted to good old-fashioned scopy. And we started copying the data. Not a sexy solution, but it actually worked fine. It still took us a few days to replicate all the data, to get the data from point A to point B. But, we fell back to a tried and true migration method. And it worked fine for them. We were able to then, on the date that was our cutover date, which we did make our, within the month, right? So the customer was very happy of that. And we were able to fail over the 4 machines that were like easy peasy, came up in our cloud, no problems. And then on that final machine, we did a final synchronization of the data over an overnight session and failed that machine over and turned them off in Azure. And at the end of the day, the customer was like, this was great. We were able to get out of Azure without too much strain and stress, and it worked out well for them.
Every customer, every enterprise, everybody, when you ask them and you start talking about migrations, right, this idea of minimal downtime comes up. And if you're trading a market, right, commodities, equities, whatever, right, downtime matters to you. If you're e-commerce and you're doing transactions, you've got some sort of OLTP that's running. Internal applications that have a finite number of users that maybe you're not, actually transactionally second by second critical. How do you walk through that with the customer and figure out what an appropriate migration time really is and set an expectations? Because we're talking about complexity and cost, right? Like simple migrations, turn everything off, move it, turn it back on, right? Less complexity, less cost, more time maybe, versus trying to run 2 systems online. So how do you walk through
really,
that process?
it comes down to, number one, does the customer really understand their application from soup to nuts, right? And also, do they understand the impact? In this particular customer, it was an internal application, but it was servicing their research group. Research means money. If they're doing energy exploration or anything like this, they don't take time off, right? The weekends, maybe not so, that's where they have a little bit of time. But, when we have discussions with customers like this, honestly, when we talk to a lot of customers, we can't have we have to have 0 downtime. We have to, we can't miss a ping, or something like this. And it really isn't until you do the workshops that you flush out what really is Like, what is the high order bit, right? What is really most important? Sometimes when you look at, when you actually start breaking down and actually talking to the subject matter experts, the, the administrators, of course, who usually say we can't have any downtime anytime ever. But then you start talking to like the finance people or maybe some of the other decision makers, and it's like, well, if it costs us this much, we're okay with a few hours of downtime, or we're okay with a day of downtime, right?
All of a
And
sudden, yeah.
that's why when we have consulting time with customers, these are things that we flesh out through the workshops, right? We will either do a workshop in person. In this particular case, we went into our conference room with a big wall size whiteboard, and we started working through the technical challenges, but also, the impact to the company. In this particular case, the impact was, we can't be down during the week because these engineers that are working in our company, they get paid a lot of money. They're the big brains, right? They're the scientists who are looking at, energy data, geographic data, looking at, things actually on the planet Earth, right? And we don't want to pay them a salary when they're just sitting downtime. So their time is very important to us. And of course, we go, well, how important? What can we quantify? Can we qualify that with dollar symbols? And sometimes customers can come up with that information and make the decision themselves. And other times, it's like, it's just a pain point that they want to try and alleviate. But in this case, we definitely hit a home run using the real-time replication product with Zerto. And it's something that we were very comfortable with through our DR as a service practice, right? Because that's something we do a lot of, right? Where we'll replicate people from their premises into our cloud platform, multi-tenant or single tenant. And when disaster strikes, it's very easy for them to hit the red button and fail over to our data centers. Anyway, but for this customer, it can be, it was the right product. We did have, some challenges, but we were able to overcome them and get the customer what they needed.
Today we have, like, in some cases, almost too many options for people in terms of how they consume or deploy compute. I'm just gonna use compute as like the overarching tool, right? So you've got data centers and co-location. Bring your own resources into a facility and get space, power, and usually ping, right? And then you've got bare metal, right? The rebranding of dedicated servers from the good old days. Now we call it bare metal. And then you get into, you're talking about private cloud options where it's actual private cloud where resources are dedicated to one customer. Or you've got multi-tenant, private cloud. I mean, in this case, it's this kind of like hybrid cloud environment where DartPoints has a vCloud director deployed, and then you kind of just keep working all the way up the stack of all these. And then the application abstraction, are you doing serverless? Are you doing containers? It's like there's so many different flowcharts. And you go all the way up and you say at the top, now you've got this like public cloud, the Azures and AWSs of the world. One of the things that I notice a lot with people when you start into this conversation is really trying to understand the differences between, if we're here, and there's all this other infrastructure available to us, how do you decide, like, which infrastructure is the right place to go to? Do we come from, Azure into a multi-tenant vCloud, or do we go down to a private vSphere, or do we actually want to deploy our own resources, or go to Hyper-V, all these different things? And the second part of this, I want to explore a little bit, I'll just prompt you with this, becomes understanding the cost differentials between them. If you're in a public cloud, there's a lot of things you don't know. Like, what does an actual vCPU mean on these platforms? How do you size your environment? How do you figure out what the oversubscribe rates are on a processor? And I see this a lot where people say, oh, this is what our resources are in the public cloud, so we have to replicate this in our private cloud. And you're like, no, you actually don't. And so as you're going through in your in this case, more one-to-one VM to VM kind of migration project, but it still turns into a big part of the of like the where does it go, and then how much does it cost, and how
Sure.
do we get it there,
Yeah.
part of the
And
conversation.
that's something that, when we were working with a particular customer, when I first, was working with this supersized VM, I'm like, do you need this much storage? you know, do you need all this data, and do you need all this free space? Right? Because they did have, so they had, some data that was landed on disk that was actually bits on silicon, right? For their projects, and then there was a lot of storage that was empty, right? And it wasn't something they could just resize or get rid of, because the way how their workflow was to copy data between LUNs, between disks, in terms of compacting projects, right? So we're talking about really, really big files that that contain, seismic data or whatever. And you know, it really comes into that talking to the customer and trying to understand what their workflows are, right? And understanding how their application works. In this particular migration, it was relatively simple, because we weren't dealing with containers. We weren't dealing with you know an overly complex solution. It was basically just IaaS as a service. So for us, for doing this migration, it was relatively straightforward, and we didn't have to do too much digging into how the application works. And we're not, DartPoints is not an application centric company, right? We are a data center focusing on colocation and cloud and infrastructure as a service. So that's kind of what when we worked with this customer, what we were able to, the challenges we were able to overcome relatively easy. What's funny is right after the migration, Zerto came back and said, "Hey, we fixed it." Okay.
You're like, great, fantastic. We'll keep that in mind for the next time. But I mean, how do you go through that process of deciding, this workload, like how much of this is performance, how much of it is
Yeah.
finance, how much of it is administration, saying like, we're going to put this on vCloud, we're going to put this on private vSphere, we're going to put this here. What's
Yeah,
driving that
and
now for
really,
you?
so I would say, when we do analysis of the machines, right? We look and see, okay, do you really need the resources you need? And in most cases, when people are sizing things in Azure or AWS, they kind of like, it's there, let's use it. Let's just take that storage,
Mm-hmm.
let's take that compute. And we have some tools that we can deploy on behalf of the customer that kind of looks and sees how much resources are they really using, and is it the right choice
Right.
to um to have a one for one. Maybe we could downsize, right? Storage is one of those things for this particular customer that was kind of like something they didn't want to change on. But when we were looking at like CPU and RAM, um, we were like, you're really not using that much CPU. You're not using that much RAM. Let's right size this. So we have tools that we deploy into in hyperscalers or in our own environments that we can use to kind of, let's see what the application really is taking, and can we shorten it up. And then when we look at the decision to where the target will be, um, we can ask the customer, listen, is a multi-tenant cloud going to be good for you, right? Just because it's in cloud doesn't give you, the comfort that maybe you need to have hypervisor access. Maybe you're running an application that needs to talk to vCenter or vSphere, in which case private cloud, public cloud on something like vCloud Director maybe isn't the right choice. So, during that workshop, and it can be a day or it can be, a few hours and spread it over a couple of days. These are the questions we ask, right, to really make sure we're going in the right direction for a customer. So when we look at the solution as a whole, we look at our metrics that we get from the hyperscaler, or even if it's in a customer prem location, we get those metrics and we look and see, is it the right choice? And then we look and see, where are we going to, and is that target the right choice for the customer?
It gets really messy though, right? I mean, because now it's like, you know, does this go to Azure? Does it go to vCloud? Does it go to vSphere? You know, and I feel I'm very sympathetic to it. You know, you see people trying to struggle, struggling and trying to go through these decisions and figure out what goes where, and especially with the other side of it, which is we deployed this whole thing, and we'll just pick on Azure. We deployed this whole thing in Azure, and now,
Yeah.
like, whoops, we kind of and there's lots of things that drive that conversation, but a lot of times, you know finances become a fixed resource. Like,
Mhm.
it's a limiting factor, for every, I mean, I don't care who you are, right? At some point, like, you just can't spend your
Sure.
way out of every problem to a certain point. um how much has this changed, in the last year, in terms of conversations you're having with companies, in terms of where they're selecting and how they're choosing? Because the data center businesses, all data center operators had to, I think they fought the cloud, and now have all embraced the
Mhm.
cloud, and they've been, and it's just this, I understand, it's like some stuff is going to be in Azure, and we're going to help you with your stuff in Azure, and some stuff's going to be with us, and we're going to, so how has this shifted, with DartPoints and your approach over the
I
last few
mean,
years?
um, yeah, that's a great question. I really feel it comes down to the consulting that we do, and really going from just having a technical discussion to also going into, um, you know, kind of going into financials, right? And really getting the customer to talk about, um, you know, what is it, what is the point where it makes sense, right, to move to away from a hyperscaler like AWS and Azure or Google Cloud Platform. Um, has it changed? I mean, somewhat. I mean, because we still have customers that are traditional colocation, or we have customers that are dealing with things like the VMware tax, right? The whole disruption with VMware and Broadcom. So that is something that you know I think is our approach is always is kind of been the same, and has it changed over the years about how we leverage it? And I'm kind of like not answering this question well. um,
But you bring up the VMware tax, and I don't feel like, I mean, look, Broadcom is really good about acquiring things and then
mhm,
maximizing their investment, right? You buy something because you think that there's an opportunity for you to make
right.
money with it, right? So that's just the way stuff works. It's more like, I don't even think it doesn't even feel like Broadcom knows what they're doing, and their strategy. It's like not to make a pun here, but like, throwing darts at the board, and then like, oh, that one
Yeah.
hit, and that one hit, and this one didn't hit, and so let's adjust, and that's creating a lot of confusion
Yeah.
and uncertainty, but for the service providers as well as for the customers, and that's been very
Absolutely,
disruptive
yeah.
recently.
We definitely, so we are and will always be a VMware partner, and leverage that technology. But some of the things we're looking at, we recently had a lot of growth in our company, right? We had a capital investment from a company called Nova Infrastructure, right, which was on our LinkedIn not too long ago. So we're expanding, you know, power in some of our critical data centers, right? So we're able to offer really heavy, dense power. But we're also looking at kind of new cloud platforms, next generation cloud, where we're looking at things like, I won't name the providers, right? Because we're still evaluating and getting our chops together with
Hmm.
the new offerings. But, really giving the customer the flexibility to choose and have more of a flexible portfolio than just VMware is really critical. And we see customers,
Hmm.
you know, very frequently come to us and they're like, "Look, man, it's getting expensive. What do we do?"
Yeah,
And some customers are
yeah,
like, "Well, we're just going to pay that. We're going to run VMware,
yeah.
and that's fine, and we can still provide that solution base to the customers." But we have some customers that come to us and say, "Listen, we really don't care what, we just need our virtual machines to run. we don't really care what hypervisor we're on. And that opens up a lot of discussion and a lot of flexibility that we're going to start offering to customers, right? To give them that choice.
I mean, this comes back to like how integrated you are with the cloud
Right.
platform, right? You talk about the beginning, part of the big process here is understanding how integrated are you with Azure, and are you using Azure stuff that
Right.
can't be replicated and
Right.
has to be changed, right? And so, the value within VMware and vSphere and vCloud is there's a lot of tooling that you get with it, and not everybody uses all that tooling.
Exactly.
Right? So,
We're really finding more and more customers, as we have this discussion with our current customer base, who are customers that come to us and go, what can we do? This is crazy. We're like, and this is mainly people who are off-prem that are either replicating to us or have something in colocation, right? And they're like, look, we're doing it ourselves. We're paying for the infrastructure. We're paying for the licensing. It's just getting out of hand. What do we do? And we as a service provider can do certain things and alleviate some of the cost and complexity of retooling hardware and whatnot. But most everyone that comes to us says, listen, other than doing things like backups and replication, we don't really need to talk to the hypervisor. We just need our virtual machines to run, and understanding what plugins or what integration that a customer will need to have going to a next gen cloud. If we can solve that problem, it makes it a much more easier discussion of migrating into something that's completely different than VMware.
DartPoints has a data center footprint, and then as a result of that, a customer focus that is different from a lot of the market, right? There's not very many people that are going to say we're operating data centers at scale in Louisiana, right? It's just not, it becomes, how would you describe like your approach to the market and the customer that you're looking for as a result, and how, where your facilities are based, where people are,
Sure.
what
Yeah,
is that?
I mean, honestly, we have, so in our locations, we have several data centers in the South Carolina area. So we have data centers in Greenville, Spartanburg, Charleston, Columbia, and we actually have one in North Carolina, in Asheville. So our data centers are sort of spread between the South Central all the way up to the Southeast and Midwest. So we have data centers in South Carolina, North Carolina, Ohio, and then Indiana, and then down here in Louisiana, which is where I'm at. I'm here in the Baton Rouge data center. We actually have 2 data centers that are in the Baton Rouge campus, and then we have one in Shreveport, Louisiana, which is up north. So really our customer base is customers who maybe need to bring in, they already have their own gear, whether they're running infrastructure for conventional applications or running something that's AI centric, and they need to pull, tons of power into a cabinet, right? Typical cabinets anywhere between 5 kilowatts up to 15 kilowatts, all the way up to like 25 kilowatts, and even north of that, right? When we're looking at really, really dense workloads. So those customers we're able to cater to, right? And they're just like, I need power, I need connectivity, and I need to stay up all of the time. I don't need to go down, right? So those are the types of customers that we cater to. We also cater to customers who come to us and say, listen, I don't want to put anything in colocation. I don't want to own the hardware. I don't want to own the hypervisor. I want to come to you and consume the resources you guys have, right? And I just want to pay for what I use, and I don't want to own anything. I don't want to own the infrastructure. And those are really the 2 major type of companies we host at DartPoints.
Nowadays, everybody refers to it as AI, but it's really like GPU
Yeah.
compute, right? Like you look at data center, like footprints. I mean, even today, from a an AMD or Intel socket basis, the watt envelope on a socket hasn't changed too much over the last decade plus, right? Like you're factoring 200 watt per socket on a CPU. Disk consumes what disk consumes. So 12.5 kilowatt is a relatively dense cabinet in that kind of environment. And then you introduce like, oh, we're going to put a lot of GPUs into a cabinet because because we're doing, something that's using them. And then you're like, okay, we need 25
Yeah,
kilowatt, 50 kilowatt, 100 kilowatt, and that density changes. That, changes, that puts a lot of pressure on the
it
data center
does.
in
Absolutely.
terms of,
Hence, we building in more power recently because we see the need in the market where people, legacy compute was, like you said, 5 kilowatts, right? I have several servers I want to put in a 42 rack machine. And if you're running just
yeah.
storage and compute, not such a big deal. You can definitely easily get away with 10 kilowatt cabinet or 5 kilowatt cabinet. But when you start talking to customers who are like, listen, I need to bring in AI workloads or GPU, NVIDIA class
Mm-hmm.
racks, NVIDIA, deployments,
Mm-hmm.
it really drives up that consumption of power. And we're seeing more and more of this as we talk to customers. I mean, because people are embracing AI. It could be that they're just putting their toe in the water and just bringing in, something like a Lambda server, which is maybe something relatively small that we can kind of like deal with, or they're bringing in full NVIDIA stacks where they just need to just chuck power like it's, like it's going out of style.
The early 2000s, the CPU arms races drove a lot of power. We saw huge spikes in power consumption. Late 90s, it was 2 kilowatt cabinets, and all of a sudden it became 4 and then 5 and then 10, right? But then it plateaued, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
CPU manufacturers, I think, all kind of came to grips with, like, there is a certain power envelope that we need to stay in, and that becomes the performance barrier that we have to achieve. When does that happen with the GPUs? I mean, at what point is too much, right? 100 kilowatt cabinet. I mean,
we
that's a
I
lot,
think we will see
like,
that. I honestly think that, as AI becomes more and more prevalent, that will 100 kilowatt cabinet, that's a pretty big, that's a lot of compute, that's a lot of silicon, right? And that's a lot of heat, not only power, but you have to think about heat dissipation. Are we doing something like water cooled deployments? Yeah, I don't know. I think there's a lot of change and disruption in AI right now, where if you look at, are you doing true GPU compute? Or are you doing inference? I think a lot of this is unfolding. The one thing I am sure of is the need for dense cabinets and dense power at our data centers is continuing to increase, and that will not be going away in the near future. So I think we will probably hit a plateau, like you said earlier. I think there will be a point where we're like, okay, X amount of kilowatts per rack is what you'll use until the next big thing comes out.
first data center I stepped foot in, the floor plate was sized at 50 watt per square foot. So now, you had cages and cabinets, so you had a little more density when you actually got into the machine space, quote unquote, right? But I think about that a lot, of like 50 watt per square foot, and then versus, now you say, okay, 100 kilowatt in a cabinet, you're not talking about, I mean, 12 square feet worth of floor space. If you allocate aisle space into that as well, like it's
Yep.
pretty remarkable. What is something that I'm going to make this? I want to make this generic, but somewhat specific. People sitting in around a conference room table and having a conversation of, do we move this application to a cloud? Do we take the application out of the cloud? Right. And that conversation, that like battle is
Mm-hmm.
politely waging, right? What's something you wish more people understood or knew, that we're having these conversations internally, that would benefit from an outside expert, like just being present and saying, have you thought
Right.
about this?
I think in this particular customer that we were just talking about, I think having all of the decision makers, or at least the people, the people who are the decision makers from the standpoint of finance, from the standpoint of the application developer, the IT guy, the guy who's running the infrastructure, having them in the same room really levels the field. Because when you talk to, and I've been in situations where we only talk to the IT administrator, and we definitely have a narrative that is two-dimensional, right? We're talking speeds and feeds, and we can't have we can't have zero. It's got to be zero downtime. But when we include the application owner, or maybe the application development person, as well as the financial person, or the CIO or CTO, if we have those folks all in the same room, it kind of opens up the discussion, and it makes it easier for us to really come to a good decision where we're taking everyone into account. So if I would say a takeaway of what I wish when we do consulting or workshops with customers, is we do get the entire IT or technology board, right, in the discussion. Because when you're just talking to the IT guy or IT manager or engineer, it can sometimes be very limiting onto the entire scope and the 30,000-foot view that you get when you include really all of the application and financial people.
I still end up in arguments online. I know you're not supposed to argue with people on the internet, but I just sometimes can't help myself. I still end up in arguments online with this belief system that going to the cloud, going to the public cloud, is cheaper than running your own infrastructure or being in some sort of multi-tenant private infrastructure with a provider. What do you say to that?
2 words: it depends. Right? You really have to understand what you're doing, and like you said earlier, is your spend on public cloud or hyperscalers matching what your revenue is? Right? And if it is, and you're okay with that spend, life is good. Continue on. But yeah, being able to really understand what the customer need is really critical.
So get everybody at the table, and have a real conversation
Absolutely.
about what you're doing. And is what you're doing right, or should you make changes?
Absolutely.
William, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. This is
Absolutely. Thank you
fascinating.
for having me.